Thank you, Jackie, and thanks to the organizers of the EA meeting for having me. I'm going to talk to you today a bit about data and observing systems and sort of the global status, where we're at. I'm a researcher with the National Snow and Ice Data Center at University of Colorado, but I also am involved in data coordination and interoperability and those types of things with the International Arctic Science Committee, or IASC, that we've talked about, and SAON, which is the Sustaining Arctic Observing Networks program. So they now have what's called the Arctic Data Committee, which is tasked with trying to look at and coordinate, link different activities related to Arctic data. I'm also involved in IARPIC, which is a US group I'll talk about, and there's also a data coordination team there that's looking at things more at a national level. Also, thanks to my co-authors, Lisa Lassetto, who's with DFO in Canada and linked with SAON, as well as Phil Monday, who you all know, and Yen-Renee Larson, who is the Executive Secretary of SAON. So in my talk, I'm going to go through a number of points. I'll just very briefly talk about EA and fisheries management. We talked a lot about that yesterday, so I think there's a really good understanding in the audience of what we're talking about there. Then I'm going to go with a bit of an overview of the global observing and data system, and then talk a little bit about what we've learned in looking at data and observing over the last 10 or more years, and particularly over the last 10 years. And then how we might think about, observing and data as an ecosystem and what that may bring to us in terms of trying to look forward to managing and also just seeing what the opportunities and ways that we can grow the system. And so I'll conclude with just some ideas on the way forward and hopefully some points for discussion. So we all talked about this yesterday, so I won't go into great detail, but as somebody who's not an ecologist or not somebody directly involved in ecosystems, the ecosystems approach, the key points that I took out of this are focused on the idea that it's a systems approach, certainly, and interconnections are a big part of that systems approach, or understanding the interconnections. It's not strictly a science activity, nor is it an on-the-ground sort of implementation activity, but it has a huge policy framework around it. Scale and location are very important within the EA approach. Scientific and indigenous knowledge are very important in terms of underlying the entire approach. And so that really leads us to the idea that, it needs integrated ecosystem assessments, which implies the observations and data, and also that sound data management and availability over time is critical because there's a monitoring component. So all of that is really foundational to the whole EA idea. EA then extends to this idea of fisheries management, so using the overall ecosystems approach, but as applied to fisheries. And again, I won't say much here. There are many of you in the room who can talk about this in great detail. But from what I gather is this is, again, looking at it as a systematic approach or as a system, so you're not just focusing on the target species that are going to be harvested, but you're also looking at the overall impact on other species and on the environment, etc. There are some underlying ideas behind it, like protecting the living resources, but also then the economic aspects of sustaining the fisheries. This is, again, not strictly a scientific activity. It is something that is social, it's economic, it's cultural. In indigenous communities, there's not only an economic component of subsistence, but there are also often cultural components of the marine species, etc. So what I took from this, though, is this, I think, question, which is, what do observations and data and information play, what roles do they play in supporting the idea of ecosystems-based fisheries management? So with that, there, I think, are many relevant initiatives, and many of you in the room are either part of these or certainly aware of these different initiatives that are focusing on this, and I think that can contribute to this question in some way in addressing this question. But at the same time, we also have a lot of activity going on globally and nationally and so on. So you just saw a couple of really good examples of some individual projects. We have an observing system and a linked sort of data system that is emerging already. So Jackie used the DBO, or she talked about the DBO as one great example of something that's coming up. That's actually there on my screen as well. But we have a number of others in the atmospheric community, in the permafrost community. We have a lot going on in community-based monitoring with indigenous communities of the north. So they're starting to actually make their observations and knowledge available and linkable, if you will. And so there are some examples up there. So we do have a lot happening, and it's happening at different scales. So the scale comes into it again, is that we have a lot of global initiatives. And these are global initiatives that are not focused necessarily on the Arctic. They are groups like WMO, World Meteorological Organization, the Group on Earth Observations, et cetera, who are focused on data and observing at a global level, but they do have focused initiatives that are looking at either the Arctic or the Antarctic or both. So there's just a sort of a web map up there of different initiatives. Those are not all of the initiatives, but those are some of the key ones that have Arctic programs that are active. And you also have other groups that are not necessarily, producing data or doing it at that level, but are interested in it, like the Belmont Forum, which is a funding agency which has a large focus on data, and as well as the Research Data Alliance, which is a group that sort of tries to bring together people who are interested in research data. We have a number of broad polar initiatives, so ones that are not necessarily focused on oceans or fisheries, but are interested in the polar regions, and particularly the Arctic here. So we have SAON, Sustaining Arctic Observing Networks. EU PolarNet is a major initiative under the European Union. IASC has been mentioned a number of times. And SAON and IASC got together a couple of years ago and said, we really need a group that's going to focus on the data part of things. So that's what the new Arctic Data Committee is about, is trying to sort of work with those groups and as well as the community as a whole. There are also some really interesting initiatives in the Antarctic that I think relate to this, like the Southern Ocean Observing System. So they're doing a lot of really interesting and great work on data, as well as the Standing Committee on Antarctic Data Management. So we're working closely with them. We actually have new memorandums of cooperation with those groups so that we're all sort of working together. There are a lot of interesting international things going on, but I think, as was alluded to, a lot of the heavy lifting happens at the national level, because that's where the funding comes from. That's where, if you're thinking, we really want to do something, we've got to go, with the exception of the Belmont Forum, which really is also nationally funded, but coordinated, you have to go back to your own country. So forgive me if I've missed anybody's country in here, but there are many different programs at the national level. You go into that level, and it's fairly complicated, though. So in the U.S., and this, again, is not complete, but just gives you an idea of some of the organizations, and I think it was mentioned yesterday that there's at least 20 federal agencies that are involved in some way in the Arctic in the United States alone. And so we now have a group called IARPC, or the Interagency Research Policy Committee, that's looking at trying to coordinate across all of these agencies, including on data and observations. So there are two focus groups within IARPC that are focused on data and observations. Within Canada as well, and this is sort of, again, a high-level sort of overview, you have a number of different agencies, but you have a new entity there called Polar Knowledge Canada that's trying to bring together a number of the activities. So you have a lot going on at the international level, but also at the national level, and there are linkages, of course. We also have what I'll call the local level, and so this is the local level, and although it really is global in terms of its scope, and also I think global in terms of its importance, and this is where we look at community-based observing. So this screenshot is of the Atlas of Community-Based Monitoring, which is a partnership between Inuit Circumpolar Council and ALOCA, the Exchange for Local Observations and Knowledge of the Arctic, as well as Brown University and some other partnerships. So in this project, we brought together, basically, we've given a view of the different types of community-based observing programs that are going, and also there's a report that was just released a couple of months ago that talks about the information and data in there. And of course, we have very domain-specific activities as well that are really centrally important to this group. So we have the CBMP's Arctic Biodiversity Data Service, we have DBO, we have AUs that's releasing a number of data, we have NOAA, we have a bunch of different groups that are really putting out focused products that are centrally important. And I've been working with Phil a little bit on trying to sort of identify what those different initiatives are and how they might link together, and I'll talk a little bit about that towards the end of the presentation. So from all of these activities, with all of this going on, there is a lot of activity and discussion. So meetings, initiatives, projects, and so on. And there was a comment made, you know, there's no report or no lack of paper on it. So there are many different journal articles, reports, discussions, etc. And from that, we're learning a lot, and we know a lot. So there, often people are saying, oh, you know, we just don't have any sort of handle on data, you know, there's nothing happening. There actually is. There's a lot happening. A lot of that came out of the International Polar Year. That's almost 10 years ago now, or about 10 years ago since it started. But what we do know is that there are many opportunities. So for promoting the sharing of data and the linking of it, you know, that can help us to improve sharing, resulting in better science, etc. We're going to then have a more complete view of the environment, both in space and also time. There's new kinds of science and research that can be done. So we could not do the things that we can do now 20 years ago even because of the volume of the data that's there. By connecting it all together and the new analytical methods, we can do new things. We can learn new things in new ways. There are economic opportunities that relate to sharing the data as well, sort of directly and indirectly, just through the ability to have access to it, and a whole bunch more. But there are challenges. So this could go on longer. There are many other challenges, but I think some of the key ones that if you analyze those reports, as I've been doing for a research article, you find some trends. So of course, data rescue is one of them, and there's a lot of old data out there that just can't be accessed, so we need to figure out, you know, how to bring that into an accessible form. There are just basic things that we've talked about. How do you discover the data? How do you access it? How do you preserve it over time, etc.? Attribution and reward. How do you give credit so people will actually share their data? Because that's still an issue. You go and say, can I get your data? And they say, no, because I haven't published on it yet, and you'll get it when I publish it. Well, what if you could have a model, and this is starting to happen, where you get a citation for the data, and when you're up for promotion or whatever, people will say, oh, you published a lot of data, that matters. So those are the types of things happening there. Trying to avoid the silos, and this I think is an ongoing challenge, but seeing that there are data coming out of science initiatives, or data coming out of operations, or data coming out of communities and information, etc. How do you see that all together rather than sort of in these silos? And interoperability, which is just another way of saying how do you get all of these systems to talk to each other, and how do you get the data to flow? And that's probably the most fundamental issue that we're dealing with at many levels. So where are we now? And I think this applies not only to this community, but also to the broader global community or global system, is that there are many parts of the system in place. So we have a lot in the way of data systems, etc. We are making real progress on adding new parts. So we've seen even over the last couple of years, new initiatives, new projects, new data centers coming up. And you know, that's a good thing. So we actually have some progress, and that came up yesterday as well, as let's not beat ourselves up too much and say, you know, nothing's happening. No, a lot is happening, but we still have some ways to go. We do know the key challenges, at least now. Even 10 years ago, if you sat in a room with data managers and scientists in that, or community members, and said, what are the issues, what are the challenges we have, I don't think anybody could really get a handle on that. We now have a really good sense of that. But we don't yet have an integrated system that, you know, brings all of this together. And I think, and this is sort of my thought for today, and you're welcome to disagree with it, but I think part of the issue is that we're not really understanding and at some level managing as a system. We're seeing it as a whole bunch of parts, and it's being developed as a whole bunch of parts that have some connections, but maybe not the optimal level of connections. So one way we are, as a group, are looking at under the Arctic Data Committee is, can we sort of have a better understanding of data and observations if we think about it as an ecosystem? And so this ecosystem has producers of data, it has consumers of data, it has, in a regular sort of biological ecosystem, you'd be looking at food and nutrients, and here it's more the exchange of information, data, etc. There are flows, there are interfaces. Diversity is important, so if you have one single data center, some people say that's what we really need for the Arctic, is a single data center, but great, when that fails, what do? The whole system fails. So I think within most circles, at least, we're now looking at a distributed system, so we have that kind of diversity in the system. We're talking about things like services, so there are ecosystem services, there are data services, etc. And then this idea of decomposers in an ecosystem which break things down and recompose them. We're talking about these mediators that can take data, break it down, reuse it, make it into something new and more valuable. So all of that's sort of part of it. And I think that it is complex, but there are ways that we can deal with this complexity. We can try and understand this system that's really complicated. Is that scale matters. So if you think about it, we have, like ecosystems, local right up to international scale when we're dealing with data. We have disciplinary, so things, just looking at permafrost, for example, right to interdisciplinary, that's looking at sort of everything from the physical to the social. And we also have, small teams right up to really large teams. And if you think about it, you could have a whole number of projects, and we do have a number of projects that are up on this sort of corner, and sorry, it's getting cut off a little bit at the top, but those are the big projects that are international. They have all kinds of researchers, and they have, many disciplines involved. And so the one that I was involved in during International Polar Year was called the CFL program in Canada, had over 300 researchers from all kinds of different countries, tens of millions of dollars of funding, and it did a lot of great work. But at the same time, you also have initiatives that are national, and these can be really important because they can be sustained usually over time, so that they actually have something that can last maybe more than a few years. It might last decades. You also have academics who might be working locally with just a small team, or academics that might be an individual grad student or an individual member of the community, or some that might have a big team of people but they're working locally on one specific topic. My point here is that all of these things are important parts of the system. All of them need to be resourced, and all of them need to be part and linked. But the challenge is, how do we link them all together? How do we put them together? Exchange is part of it. And so how are we going to do that? Well, I think from yesterday we have this model of the ecosystems approach. The first part is defining the ecosystem and describing the ecosystem. And we haven't really done that as a community yet. And so this is where, in terms of the way forward, there are a number of things that we need to do. So there are some practical things, and these are happening, and I think they need to continue to happen. We need to develop standards and services and that sort of thing. So agree upon how we're going to share the data. Number of initiatives happening here on that front. We need to think about things like terminology. What's the terminology that we're using? And I think Jason talked about the idea of linguistic certainty or uncertainty. In the data world, we call that semantic interoperability. It's sort of a nerdy way of just saying we have to be able to understand what we share. So things are happening there, including links between science and indigenous knowledge, as I'm putting up here on the screen. And we have to think about interoperability. Again, how do we get all these systems to talk with each other? There are initiatives like the OGC's initiative on spatial data interoperability for the Arctic. The Arctic Data Committee is hosting a workshop in November 8th to 10th in Italy that's going to focus on interoperability for Arctic data, and that's going to be a process that's ongoing. So all of those things are sort of happening, they're practical, they're needed, but I think there's also a component that's missing, which is defining, describing, and understanding the data ecosystem. So the initiative under the Arctic Data Committee to try and address this is called Mapping the Arctic Data Ecosystem. And what we're looking to do is develop a database, a mapping, and a visualization of the system so that we can better understand it. And so we've been in contact with Phil a number of times on this and looking to work with some partners from this community. It started out as very simple sort of maps and visualizations. We've done some initial analysis of the types of things that are out there, and that's now growing into a more formal project, which is developing tools that are available on the internet and will be increasingly available. The next version of this is actually not going to just have a concept map or a tree, but it's also going to be linked to geography. So you'll be able to map out, where the data exists, etc. We're actually not specifically looking to map out all of the data. We're looking at a level higher, which is where are all the data centers, where are all the different initiatives, which will then allow you to get to the data. Because we're not trying to reinvent the wheel. There are many data centers out there, et cetera, that are already doing these things. We just want to make sure people know about them in a systematic way. So these are some of the reasons why. I won't go into sort of a lot of detail here, but basically it's to support analysis, policy development, academic research or community-based activities, and this idea of interoperability is if we want all these things to work together, we can use this type of thing to understand how to get them to work together. So there's been some recent developments. So we've already been working with the scientific experts on fish stocks in the Central Arctic Oceans Group, the Standing Committee on Antarctic Data Management, LOCA, as well as EU PolarNet. We have some new partners that have just come on board. So the first is the Pan-Arctic Options Project, which is a Belmont Forum project, and they're going to bring expertise not only in oceans expertise, but also systems thinking in partnership with the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis. And they're a group who are not necessarily an Arctic group, but focus a lot on systems thinking. There's also the University of Tromsø and the Fram Center in Norway, who are going to focus on looking at the Barents Sea in particular. And we're working with the IARPIC and the Geo Cold Regions Initiative to contribute to their efforts at sort of national and international levels. They have a lot of interest in the results of the project. And the most recent is a link with the Research Data Alliance, who are seeing a number of these initiatives pop up in different domains or different fields, and they want us to come together and try and look at this globally. So once we sort of do this, we can actually connect it to all kinds of data from across the globe. So in Denver in a couple of weeks, a number of us are getting together for a meeting at the International Data Week to talk about that. So this is where we're going with it. We're looking at doing a couple of smaller case studies with the resources that we have now, and that will develop the technology and the systems, et cetera, and the methods, and then expanding that to other communities. So going out maybe from Central Arctic Ocean fisheries, which I know is still a question mark, but I think we're moving in that direction. The atmospheric community is also voiced interest, as well as the traditional knowledge or indigenous knowledge communities. So with that, I'll say thank you very much for your time.